My husband emptied our joint account, forged my signature for a massive loan, and vanished. When he returned, he claimed I forced him into it. Throwaway account because this is still ongoing and involves legal proceedings. I'm 34F and my husband Derek is 37M. We've been married for 8 years, and until 3 months ago, I thought I knew who I was married to. What happened to me could happen to anyone, and I'm sharing this because I want people to understand how quickly someone you trust completely can destroy your entire financial life and then blame you for it. Derek and I met in college when we were both studying business. He was charming, ambitious, and seemed to have his life together. We dated for 3 years before getting married, and during that time, he never showed any red flags around money. He was actually pretty conservative with spending and always talked about the importance of building wealth for our future. After we got married, we combined our finances completely. Joint checking and savings accounts, both our names on the mortgage, shared credit cards, the whole traditional married couple setup. Derek handled most of the day-to-day finances because he enjoyed it and was good with numbers. I focused on my career in graphic design while he worked in sales for a medical device company. For years, this arrangement worked perfectly. Derek would show me our budget spreadsheets, we'd discuss major purchases together, and we were steadily building our savings and paying down our mortgage. He'd send me monthly updates about our financial progress, complete with charts and projections. I trusted him completely. Looking back, I can see that Derek was gradually taking more and more control over our money. It started innocently. He'd handle the bills because he was home earlier than I was. Then he'd make investment decisions because he had been researching it. Slowly, I became less and less involved in the actual management of our finances, even though legally everything was still in both our names. The first sign something was wrong came in early March. I went to use our debit card at the grocery store and it was declined. I figured it was just a bank error or maybe Derek had transferred money between accounts. When I called him, he said there had been some temporary confusion with our bank and that he'd sorted it out. But when I got home that evening, Derek seemed agitated and distracted. He kept checking his phone and jumping every time it rang. When I asked if everything was okay, he said work was just really stressful and that he might need to travel more for his job in the coming weeks. Things are really competitive right now, he told me. I might need to put in some extra effort to hit my sales targets. I didn't think much of it. Derek's job had always had ups and downs, and he'd traveled for work before. The second sign came a week later when I tried to log into our online banking to check our account balance. My password had been changed. When I asked Derek about it, he said the bank had required all customers to update their security information and that he'd handled it for both of us. I'll get you the new login information, he promised. But he kept forgetting, or saying he'd left it at work, or that he needed to call the bank to verify some details first. By this point, I was starting to feel uneasy. Derek was acting strange, distant, secretive, constantly on his phone. He was coming home late from work and leaving early in the morning. When I suggested we go out for dinner or plan a weekend trip, he'd make excuses about being too busy or needing to save money. Let's just lay low for a while, he'd say. I want to make sure we're in a good financial position before we start spending on extras. This seemed reasonable, but it was also unlike Derek, who usually enjoyed going out and never worried too much about spending money on experiences. The third sign was when I answered a phone call from our mortgage company asking about a missed payment. I was confused because Derek had always been meticulous about paying bills on time. When I told the representative that there must be some mistake, she informed me that our account was actually 2 months behind. When I confronted Derek about this, he seemed genuinely surprised and concerned. He said he'd call the mortgage company immediately to straighten things out, that it was probably a bank error or a problem with automatic payments. He was so convincing that I believed him. I'll handle this right away, he assured me. You don't need to worry about it. But I was worrying. 3 strange incidents in a month was too many to be coincidental. I decided to go to our bank in person to figure out what was happening with our accounts. What I discovered at the bank was devastating. Our joint checking account, which should have had about $15,000 based on Derek's last update, had a balance of $247. Our savings account, which should have had around $40,000, was completely empty. The bank representative pulled up our transaction history, and I watched in horror as she scrolled through months of withdrawals, transfers, and payments I'd never seen before. Large cash withdrawals, wire transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, payments to companies I'd never heard of. "Ma'am, are you aware of these transactions?" the representative asked gently. I wasn't aware of any of them. The signature cards on file showed both Derek's signature and mine, but I didn't remember signing most of the documents she was showing me. "When was the last time you made a transaction on this account yourself?" she asked. I realized it had been months. Derek had been handling everything. But the worst revelation was still coming. The representative pulled up a separate screen and showed me a personal loan for $85,000 that had been taken out against our home equity just 2 weeks earlier. Both Derek and I were listed as borrowers, and both our signatures were on the loan documents. "I never signed this," I said, staring at the paperwork. "I've never seen these documents before." The signature looked like mine, but I knew I hadn't signed it. The handwriting was close, but not quite right. Derek had apparently forged my signature to secure a massive loan against our house. "Ma'am, if you're alleging that your signature was forged, we'll need to file a report and investigate this," the representative said. This would be a serious matter of fraud. I felt like I was going to throw up. Not only had Derek drained all our accounts, but he'd also put our house at risk with a loan I'd never agreed to. We were suddenly $85,000 in debt on top of being completely broke. I tried calling Derek immediately, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I called his office, but his supervisor said he'd taken emergency leave and hadn't been in for several days. That's when I realized Derek had disappeared. I drove home in a panic, hoping to find him there so we could figure out what was happening. But when I got to our house, Derek's car was gone. Most of his clothes were missing from our closet, and there was a note on our kitchen counter. The note was short and devastating. "Sarah, I'm sorry. I got in over my head and I couldn't figure out how to fix it. I need some time to sort things out. I'll explain everything when I can. I love you." That was it. No explanation of where the money had gone, no timeline for when he'd be back, no contact information. Just an apology and a promise to explain later. I called the police to report that Derek was missing and that I suspected financial fraud. They took a report but explained that since Derek had left voluntarily and had legal access to our joint accounts, there wasn't much they could do immediately. The forged signature issue would need to be investigated by the bank and potentially the district attorney's office. I also called a lawyer that same day. She explained that proving signature forgery could be complicated, especially between spouses who share accounts and regularly sign each other's names for routine transactions. "The challenge is going to be proving that you didn't give him permission to sign your name," she said. Courts often assume that spouses have implied consent for financial matters. Over the next few days, I started piecing together what Derek had done. He'd been systematically draining our accounts for months, probably to cover some kind of debt or financial obligation I didn't know about. When the money ran out, he'd forged my signature to get the home equity loan. Then, when he couldn't keep up the charade anymore, he'd just disappeared. I was completely broke, behind on my mortgage, and responsible for a massive loan I'd never signed. I had to borrow money from my parents just to buy groceries and pay basic bills. The worst part was not knowing why. Derek and I had never had money problems that I knew about. We made good money, lived within our means, and had been saving consistently. What could have happened that would drive him to steal everything we had and then abandon me to deal with the consequences? For 3 weeks, I heard nothing from Derek. No phone calls, no emails, no messages through friends or family. It was like he'd vanished from the earth. I hired a private investigator to try to find him, which cost money I didn't have but felt necessary to get answers. Then, on a Tuesday morning in April, Derek just walked through our front door like nothing had happened. I was working from home that day when I heard Derek's key in the front door. My first emotion was relief. At least he was alive and I could finally get some answers. But that relief quickly turned to anger and disbelief as Derek walked into our kitchen acting like he'd just been on a business trip. "Hey, babe," he said, setting down a small duffel bag. Sorry, I've been out of touch. Work stuff got really complicated. I stared at him in shock. Work stuff? Derek, you emptied our bank accounts and disappeared for 3 weeks. I've been living on borrowed money and trying to save our house. He had the audacity to look confused. What are you talking about? I told you I might need to travel more for work. You left a note saying you got in over your head and needed time to sort things out. You've been gone for 3 weeks without any contact. Where have you been? Derek's expression shifted to something I'd never seen before, cold and calculating. Sarah, I think you're confused about what happened. You're the one who told me to take money out of our accounts. You said we needed cash for some investments you wanted to make. I felt like I was losing my mind. That's completely untrue. I never told you to drain our accounts. And I certainly never told you to take out a home equity loan. The loan was your idea, he said calmly. You said we should leverage the equity in our house to invest in cryptocurrency. You were really insistent about it. This was absolutely insane. I hate cryptocurrency and think it's a scam. Derek knew this because we'd talked about it many times. I would never suggest taking out a loan to invest in something so risky. Derek, you forged my signature on loan documents. I have never agreed to any cryptocurrency investments. I didn't forge anything, he said, his voice getting defensive. You signed those papers yourself. Maybe you don't remember because you were stressed about work, but you definitely signed them. He was gaslighting me so blatantly that it took my breath away. Not only had he stolen our money and abandoned me, but now he was trying to convince me that I had somehow orchestrated the whole thing. Where have you been for 3 weeks? I demanded. I was staying with my brother while I worked on setting up the cryptocurrency accounts, he said. I told you I was going to handle the technical stuff while you focused on work. Derek's brother lived across the country. I called him immediately, with Derek standing right there. His brother sounded confused and said he hadn't seen Derek in months. When I hung up and confronted Derek about the lie, he just shrugged. I was staying with a friend. I didn't want to worry you with details. What friend? Where's our money, Derek? The money is invested. It's not liquid right now, but it's growing. You need to be patient and trust the process we agreed on. Show me, I said. Show me these cryptocurrency accounts. Show me where our $85,000 is. Derek claimed he'd left his laptop with the account information at his friend's house and would get it later. He kept insisting that I had agreed to all of this and that I was just confused or stressed. But the most disturbing part was how convinced he seemed. Derek wasn't acting like someone who knew he was lying. He was acting like someone who genuinely believed his version of events. It was like he'd rewritten history in his mind to make himself the victim instead of the perpetrator. Sarah, I'm worried about you, he said. You seem really confused and paranoid. Maybe you should talk to someone about this stress you're under. When I told him I'd already spoken to a lawyer and reported the signature forgery to the bank, he acted shocked and hurt. You called a lawyer on me? I can't believe you'd think I would steal from us. After everything we've been through together, you really think I'm capable of that? The manipulation was so sophisticated and deliberate that I started to question my own memory. Had I somehow agreed to investments I didn't remember? Had I signed documents while distracted and forgotten about it? But then I remembered the months of secrecy, the changed passwords, the lies about bank errors. I remembered the mortgage company calling about missed payments and Derek's surprise and concern. If this had all been my idea, why had he been acting so strange and secretive for months? I told Derek he needed to leave, that I didn't believe his story and that I needed space to figure out what had really happened. Fine, he said, suddenly dropping the concerned husband act. But when you realize you're making a huge mistake and destroying our marriage over your own confused memories, don't expect me to just come running back. He packed another bag and left, but not before making sure to tell me that our financial problems were my fault and that he'd been trying to help fix a situation I had created. After Derek left that second time, I threw myself into investigating what had really happened to our money. With my lawyer's help, I subpoenaed bank records, credit reports, and any other financial documents I could access. What we discovered was even worse than I'd imagined. Derek hadn't just stolen our savings. He'd been running a sophisticated financial scheme for almost 2 years. He'd opened credit cards in both our names without my knowledge, using my forged signature. He'd taken out personal loans from multiple lenders. He'd even borrowed money from his 401k and taken cash advances against our credit cards. The total amount of debt he'd accumulated was over $150,000. But the money hadn't gone to cryptocurrency investments like he'd claimed. It had gone to a gambling addiction I never knew he had. My private investigator traced Derek's activities during his 3-week disappearance. He'd been in Las Vegas, staying at casinos and running up enormous debts. The friend he'd supposedly been staying with was actually a loan shark who'd been fronting Derek money for gambling. Phone records showed that Derek had been in contact with this loan shark for months before he disappeared. The entire story about cryptocurrency investments had been fabricated to explain where the money had gone. My lawyer explained that Derek had likely panicked when his gambling debts became unmanageable. He'd probably borrowed money from dangerous people and needed cash quickly to pay them back. That's why he'd forged my signature for the home equity loan. It was a last desperate attempt to get enough money to cover his debts before his creditors did something drastic. When that money ran out too, he'd fled to Las Vegas to try to gamble his way out of the hole he'd dug. Obviously, that had only made things worse. The most devastating part was realizing how long Derek had been lying to me. The monthly financial updates he'd been sending me were completely fabricated. Our savings had been spent months ago. Our investment accounts had been liquidated to pay gambling debts. Even our retirement accounts had been raided. Derek had been living a double life for almost 2 years, systematically destroying our financial future while presenting me with fake spreadsheets and false progress reports. When he returned home that day in April, he hadn't come back to make things right or to confess what he'd done. He'd come back to try to manipulate me into taking responsibility for his actions. By claiming that the financial decisions had been my idea, he was hoping to shift the blame and avoid the legal consequences of fraud and forgery. The gaslighting had been deliberate and calculated. He'd probably spent his 3 weeks in Vegas rehearsing his story and figuring out how to convince me that I was the one who had caused our financial ruin. Armed with this evidence, I filed for divorce and pressed charges for fraud, forgery, and identity theft. I also filed for bankruptcy to protect myself from the debts Derek had accumulated in my name. Derek fought the charges, maintaining his story that I had agreed to all the financial transactions and that he was being falsely accused. He hired a lawyer and claimed that I was vindictive and mentally unstable. But the evidence was overwhelming. Handwriting experts confirmed that my signatures had been forged on multiple documents. Bank security footage showed Derek making large withdrawals from our accounts while I was at work. Phone records proved he'd been in contact with gambling establishments and loan sharks for months. Most damning was the timeline. Derek claimed I had agreed to cryptocurrency investments, but the money had actually gone to Las Vegas casinos. He claimed I had signed loan documents, but bank cameras showed him visiting the bank alone. He claimed I was confused about recent events, but I had contemporaneous emails and text messages showing my confusion about our financial situation. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. Derek was convicted of fraud and identity theft and sentenced to 3 years in prison. I was awarded our house, though it's heavily mortgaged, and half of Derek's remaining assets, which wasn't much. The financial recovery has been slow and painful. I'm still paying off debts that Derek accumulated in my name, even though I wasn't responsible for creating them. My credit score was destroyed and is only now starting to recover. I had to take a second job to make ends meet and will probably be rebuilding my financial life for the next decade. But the emotional recovery has been even harder. Derek's betrayal wasn't just about money, it was about the systematic destruction of trust and reality. For 2 years, he'd been lying to me about every aspect of our financial life while I trusted him completely. When he was finally caught, instead of confessing and apologizing, he tried to convince me that I was crazy and that his crimes were actually my idea. The gaslighting was so intense and sophisticated that I still sometimes question my own memories. Even with all the evidence proving that Derek was lying, part of me wonders if I somehow missed signs or failed to ask the right questions. Derek's manipulation was designed to make me doubt my own perceptions and take responsibility for his actions. I'm in therapy now, working through the trauma of financial abuse and psychological manipulation. My therapist has helped me understand that what Derek did was a form of domestic abuse that's unfortunately common but rarely talked about. Financial abuse is about power and control, she explained. The goal is to make the victim dependent and confused, so they can't leave or fight back. Derek had systematically isolated me from our financial information, made me dependent on his expertise, and then used that control to steal everything we had. When his scheme collapsed, he tried to make me believe that I was responsible for our problems. I've learned that this pattern is typical of financial abusers. They create financial chaos and then blame their victims for the consequences. They use their victims' confusion and trust against them, making them feel responsible for problems they didn't create. What makes it even more insidious is that financial abuse often looks like normal relationship dynamics from the outside. One spouse handling the finances isn't unusual. Gradual changes in financial control can seem natural and reasonable. By the time the victim realizes what's happening, the damage is often already done. I'm sharing this story because I want people to understand how quickly and completely someone you trust can destroy your financial life. I also want people to know that if your partner is becoming secretive about money, changing passwords without telling you, or making major financial decisions without your input, these are red flags that shouldn't be ignored. Most importantly, I want people to know that if something like this happens to you, it's not your fault. Financial abusers are skilled manipulators who use their victims' trust and love against them. The confusion and self-doubt you feel after being betrayed are normal responses to abnormal treatment. Derek tried to convince me that I was crazy, confused, and responsible for our financial problems. But I wasn't any of those things. I was the victim of a deliberate, calculated campaign of financial abuse and psychological manipulation. It's taken me 2 years to rebuild my life and my sense of reality. I'm still dealing with the financial consequences of Derek's actions, but I'm no longer questioning my own perceptions or taking responsibility for his choices. The trust I lost will probably never fully return. I'll always be more cautious about shared finances and more vigilant about protecting my own financial independence. But I've also learned that I'm stronger and more resilient than I knew. Derek tried to destroy my life and then convince me it was my fault. He failed on both counts.